Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's seminar, from Cold War to Civilizational Conflict on Learning, Relearning, and Unlearning. My name is Alex Cooley. I'm the director of the Harriman Institute, professor of political science at Barnard, and it is just a great pleasure to welcome back Professor Mark von Hagen. I see a lot of friends, a lot of old acquaintances here, so Mark doesn't need an introduction, but I'll give a short one nonetheless. Mark is recently appointed interim director of the Melikian, is it Melikian? Melikian Center for Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies at Arizona State University, with a focus on Ukrainian-Russian relations. And of course, he taught for 24 years here at Columbia University, where he also chaired the history department, and he directed the Harriman Institute. And in fact, I took legacies with Mark here at the Harriman Institute 19 years ago. It was, and it was a great course. It was a great course. And so Mark has been enormously influential, not only in the field of history, but also in institution building, in networking, in facilitating really important and tough dialogues between different communities. He also serves as a professor and dean of the philosophy faculty at the Free Ukrainian University in Munich. He is chair of the International Advisory Board of the German Ukrainian Historians Commission. He was elected president of the International Association for Ukrainian Studies in 2002 and presided over the Congress in Donetsk in 2005. And he also served as president of the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies in 2009. Mark simply has been an inspirational figure and just a giant in our various fields. So just a final word. Mark's talk is part of our kind of 70th anniversary Harriman series, where we're marking, some say celebrating our 70th anniversary, and asking old friends of the Institute, colleagues, faculty, students, postdocs, to reflect upon this, what's a very important moment in terms of our own 70th, but also the 25th anniversary of dissolution of the Soviet Union. And we've asked them all to focus on kind of big picture, big issue kinds of issues. And so it doesn't get bigger than this. Mark, welcome back, and we're really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you all for coming to hear a voice from the past who's now back in business again. Unexpectedly, and in a time of all sorts of changes that I think most of us had not anticipated 25 years ago. And Alex's invitation to kind of reflect on the state of our field, it came at a very opportune time for me to start engaging in some very preliminary comparisons of my experience at the Harriman, and more recently, since July 1st, my experience at Arizona State University's Melikian Center, when I stepped back into a role that in the field that I saw would be very familiar. But not surprisingly, I quickly learned that this kind of sudden reimmersion in the role of a director of an area studies center in a major research university nonetheless requires a lot of learning and relearning and even some unlearning. And in new contexts, I'm just rediscovering books and scholars and knowledge that for various reasons I had overlooked in the past. And learning is, after all, what universities and other institutions of higher education are supposed to be about. And it's academic and university-based area studies centers that what I know best, and what will therefore be the focus of my remarks. The focus of those centers remains what it has pretty much always been, helping prepare students for global citizenship and introducing them to the best research and teaching about regions of the world through language training and familiarization with the cultures, societies, economies, and politics of the countries constituting whatever region we now identify as ours. And any attempt to capture where we are in area studies can only be a snapshot in a rapidly evolving and transforming world of constant change. As a humanist, I can only lay claim to my own experience, which has included listening to and learning from a lot of other people's experiences, and my processing of those experiences that has led me to some sort of methods or perhaps sensibilities of how I learn, teach, and maybe even live in the world of what we once called area studies, more specifically Soviet studies, sometimes comparative communism, and more recently Russian, Eurasian, and East European studies. And where I stand disciplinarily maybe is also kind of a good starting point. I'm at a major public university now, led by Michael Crow, who came to Arizona State University from Columbia University. I didn't come with him, but I came after him. And he's been building what he calls the New American University out there in the desert. I started as the chair of the history department there, and then became the founding director of the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. And then I went into semi-intellectual exile in the School of Politics and Global Studies. And now my tenure home is in the School of International Letters and Cultures, and I'm in the Faculty of German, Romanian, and Slavic Languages. So I kind of ended up, in some ways, where I once started. My longest job to date was at Columbia, and since I'm here at the Harriman, my default comparison with ASU will be Columbia. So take this as a preliminary view from the desert or the frontier or the peripheries or the trenches, depending on your understanding of American geography these days. I've concluded that ASU's paradigmatic philosopher is probably Heraclitus, who saw flux and change as our ultimate reality. And ASU has a focus on entrepreneurship, on innovation, applied research and teaching, community impact. Columbia, by comparison, who does all those things, seems a place where tradition is at least relatively more esteemed and even institutionalized, for example, in the core curriculum that I taught in for nearly all of my 24 years here. The ASU focus on innovation and entrepreneurship is in part a reflection, I think, of the political economy of higher education, where state is less and less appropriate for our universities' titles. Instead, public better reflects the reliance on student tuition and the decline of state budget transfers. It also has meant the proliferation of an aggressive pursuit of all sorts of private-public sector partnerships, some of which also present new intellectual, academic, moral, and ethical problems. The first big difference, then speaking of political economy, between Harriman and Melikian is its funding sources. The Harriman's large endowment, built up over 70 years, does not rule out fundraising from outside sources, but did not make fundraising an existential strategy. The Melikian Center, by contrast, has a small endowment, $2 million, from this Armenian American and Persian family, and depends almost entirely for its operations on the Department of Defense, the State Department, and not education and cultural affairs, but intelligence and research, intelligence and that kind of research. And as more recently, the National Security Agency, Education, Energy, Homeland Security Agency, and others. And that entangles ASU's area studies much more tightly with the national security roles than was the case for Columbia, although we had our entanglements too, and as well as other private top-tier universities that support area studies programs. And so that's one kind of thing that I think, the elite universities are elite, but most of us in the trenches, I think this is more the reality of dependence on the national security industrial complex. But despite these important structural differences, which I don't want you to forget, I hope to make a case that our area studies community has been learning all along for the past 25 years since the end of the USSR and the Soviet Empire in 1991. So I'm going to start briefly with a tour, since he's making me do one of these oral histories. You're going to get a lot of sort of combination of the micro and the global. I started teaching at Columbia in January 1985. 2 months later, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary, and the period of accelerating reforms that led to the breakup of the Soviet Union, Soviet Empire began. I had been on IREX the year before, during 1982-83, and witnessed the national, via television and local, in Leningrad reaction to Leonid Brezhnev's death, which is another beginning of the ultimate and eventual end. I was on a Fulbright IREX fellowship to Moscow and Leningrad as a grad student in history and humanities at Stanford University, where I wrote a dissertation about the Red Army during the 1920s as a laboratory for what I called militarized socialism. And there, as I had throughout my education, I was taught how to appreciate and understand Russian historiography from Terence Emmons and Alexander Dahlen, who held a PhD in history from Columbia and had served in World War II and after as a U.S. Army translator, including a study of the documents of German occupation of the Soviet Union during World War II, a topic that eventually became my own, kind of regarding an earlier war, World War I. The exchanges and opportunities for study abroad and language study were key to my career and to area studies more broadly. Already as a student in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, majoring in international relations and still considering a career in diplomacy, I made my first trip to the USSR on a summer language program in 1975 under the auspices of the CIEE, and 4 months later I won a berth among 30 Americans living in Leningrad and studying for the winter semester of '76. And on that very first trip in 1975, although most of our time was spent in Leningrad, we had a week in Moscow, we had a few days in Novgorod, so we got to see 3 very different Soviet Russian cities. But we also went to Tallinn, Estonia, we went to Tbilisi, Georgia, and we left through Kiev almost sort of prophetically. I was leaving through Kiev and eventually coming back in some ways. So I had an idea already then that the Soviet Union was more than Russia, and that there was something I needed to learn to make sense of all of that. Okay, so in between Georgetown and Stanford, I did an MA in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures at Indiana University, where I taught myself an intensive first-year Russian class, which is now what we do every summer at Arizona State and still at Indiana and Middlebury and places like that. And I later even led the Georgetown group for the summer CIE language program in 1980, the year of our Olympic boycott, which caused all sorts of other interesting complications. Even though my appointment at Columbia was in history, where I was tenured and promoted until my very last year, my office was not in Fairweather across the street, where most of my colleagues over there, but in SIPA with my colleagues in Russian and East European history and political science. When I served as associate director and then director, I appeared even less often in Fairweather, though I usually had a class there or in Hamilton. The Harriman stood to me for area studies. It was a kind of friendly family, and people who cared about the same region from different points of view. In my understanding, was one of the earliest versions, if not the earliest version, what we now call interdisciplinarity, and more recently transdisciplinarity, and usually meant something at least more than an even old-fashioned comparative studies, although we meant that too. We taught together in the conviction that, and even that we understand better when we understand similar things in other places and other times, and that practitioners of different disciplines ought to be able to learn from one another. Each discipline brings its own strengths and blindnesses to important processes occurring in the world. And I co-taught with all sorts of people from Bob McGuire to Kathy Nepomniachtchi, Rick Erickson, Karen Barkey, Michael Stanislavski. I had neighbors, Istvan Deyak. I was on dissertations all across the university. I began my imperial turn, in fact, under the influence of Michael Stanislavski, who called to say he couldn't make it here. He's got caught in traffic, typical New York story, and his students in Russian East European Jewish history, such that it's hard for me today to imagine Russian history without Jewish history and its fascinating studies of what we call today a national minority, living in empires and working within the limits of those empires to sustain their communities and produce even great cultures. Jewish history is also paradigmatic diaspora history. It's also hard for me to imagine the history of Russia and Eurasia without Ukraine, after my tutoring here at Columbia at the hands of Alex Mudl and Frank Sisson, with whom I also co-taught a seminar, or Turks and Islam, after I studied Turkish for a couple of years. Empire has become a major research and teaching focus, and I propose it as a major sub-theme for area studies, if only as legacies or imperial situations or neo-imperialism or neo-colonialism, and I'll try to convince you of that eventually. And another arena of studies, area studies that have led me in this direction have been conferences and collaborative research projects that I've also learned a lot from. the Association for the Study of Nationalities. I was very much involved during my Columbia years here and tried to make it a very central part of what we do at the Harriman, and I think that's been a wonderful success story as the premier, I still think it's the premier international, intergenerational, and interdisciplinary group of scholars devoted to problems of empire and nationality, that's my interpretation, and growing out of Columbia's long-functioning seminar on Soviet nationality problems. I spent 1991 in Berlin as a fellow a Humboldt Fellow at Free University of Berlin's Osteuropa Institute. And at the beginning of the year I was in Moscow. I witnessed during that year in Berlin the transfer of Germany's capital from Bonn to Berlin and the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Potsdam and East Berlin. And during that summer I was part of one of the first meetings of still Soviet, German, American, and British historians of World War II at the Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio conference site, one of the most pleasant conferences. The end of the Soviet Union opened an era of new and exciting fields of cooperation, mutual learning, and relearning. Already before 1991, the Ford Foundation funded a multi-year project with Moscow Memorial, for which I served as the PI in the United States. We brought to the US and Europe researchers, including former dissidents, to bring back other dissidents' archives and other samizdat and tamizdat collections to Moscow. Also, during the first half of the 1990s, then Estonian Foreign Minister Toomas Ilves, a Columbia alumnus, invited a team of Columbia contemporary civilization teachers to bring our model of liberal education around the classics of Western political and moral thought to Tartu University, one of Europe's oldest. I was part of a team of social scientists who helped set up a textbook competition under the auspices of George Soros' Transformation of the Social Sciences project in Russia. And I worked as a consultant for Primary Source Microfilms, later the Gale Group, and later part of Thomson Publishing Empire, for their Russian archive series, thanks to which I got to know the directors and highlights and histories of the major archives in Moscow, Petersburg, Kiev, and even Warsaw. I participated in 2 summer social science workshops of the Moscow Public Science Foundation and taught together with Russian historians, anthropologists, sociologists, and political scientists at Yaroslavl and Tarusa, and later served on the selection committee of the foundation with Russian scholars. Another Ford grant funded the Russian Empire Project with Jane Burbank at NYU NYU now, then at Michigan, with the late Anatoly Remnev, a dean of Siberian historians at Omsk State University, but also representative of the Petersburg School, and his mentor Ananich. And it was during those years and that project and my frequent trips to Russia for conferences and for consulting on archival projects that I realized how much energy we had spent in keeping our vigilance in contacts with our Soviet colleagues, worried that we might get them in trouble in the first place, but also worried about possible repercussions for us. In Omsk, Samara, and New York, Russians, including several scholars from the national republics, and Americans were able to talk freely. We read the same books together, shared drafts of essays with one another, and rode up and down rivers singing songs while we had our symposia. The Kazan Conference with Boris Kasparov, then at UC Berkeley, recently at Columbia, now back in St. Petersburg, and Catherine Yevtukhov, who's now here at Columbia, where my concluding session with Boris Ananich led to my first manifesto of the imperial turn. But even that manifesto was in part a response to a young Tatar's incendiary protest against some of the largely well-intentioned Moscow and Petersburg liberal colleagues. When he heard the words friendship of peoples, he said he wanted to take up a machine gun and mow us all down. And then finally, the Ukraine-Russia project with NEH, Humboldt, and the Canadians through Ukrainian Studies was about the possibilities of achieving at least some kind of impartiality, if not a collective history of Ukraine and Russia. We had that kind of a dream, a collective history of Ukraine and Russia. Of course, I wrote an incendiary article myself called Does Ukraine Have a History?, incited by Alex Model. And again, Ukraine has been extremely important in my understanding of empire and nation and the complications. So 2001, I was on leave at Columbia University in 9/11. The month before, I had been teaching in Minsk at the European University, now relocated to Vilnius, when I tried to represent my colleague Gayatri Chakravorty-Spivak in a course on post-coloniality. I read her post-colonial critique of reason on the plane over to Minsk, and had many headaches, where I alternated teaching my mostly post-Soviet material with morning sessions on Latin American versions of post-coloniality with an Argentinian literary scholar from Duke. And Minsk was also a very kind of first important realization of a post-1991 experience of another outcome, and this is 2001, of the breakup of the Soviet Empire, namely Lukashenko-style dictatorships whose opposition members disappear, are in jail, in exile, or contemplating one of those futures for themselves. And again, where the university I taught at, funded by Soros and other Western foundations, was forced to decamp to Vilnius because it was threatened by Lukashenko education bureaucrats and the president himself. The students we taught came from across the former Soviet republics and even included Mongolia. The working language is supposed to be English and Russian, but Russian worked better. What once was an anomaly has become the norm, and different trends were already evident in most of the Central Asian states, the Caucasian ones as well, and with qualified exceptions at times Mongolia and recently Georgia, at moments the Baltic states more generally. So one lesson we learned is that we should not generalize as much about the Soviet legacy, while not ignoring or forgetting it entirely. That Belarus in 2001 was already an indicator that democratization was not irreversible and that transition was not going to be as smooth or as positive a story as many of us had hoped in just 10 years earlier. The other thing before I left New York, I was, as Alex mentioned, president of the International Association for Ukrainian Studies. I was elected in Chernivtsi, one imperial capital of Austria-Hungary, and held my presidency in Donetsk, a peacetime Donetsk, full of roses and full of cafes and life, and it's just hard to imagine the Donetsk of today. Because of that presidency, I had extensive and sometimes intensive interactions with the Ministry of Higher Education, the Ministry of Culture and Sport, and the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences in Kiev, and I led an effort for 3 years to try to internationalize the association, but I learned very quickly the power of old bureaucratic inertia and survival techniques. One after effect of the breakup also has been the creation by the ACLS of the International Association for Humanists, the MAC, Международная ассоциация гуманитариев, and that includes scholars from Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. It met several times in Lviv, it met in Russia, it met in Minsk, and this summer it met in Lviv still, with Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian humanists still meeting together to discuss. From all I heard, I couldn't go. I was on the program committee, but I couldn't go. But I heard that it was a good success, and I hope for more of these sort of continuing these kind of connections. In 2004, all of this brought me to my AHR manifesto, Empire, Borderlands, and Diasporas, Eurasia as an anti-paradigm, and I think I'm going to try to defend that it's not that old, it's only 12 years old, as kind of one of the main sort of foci of our area studies. What I've been learning at ASU since I left, and this part I entitled From Empire and Colonialism to Civilizational Conflict. So I left Columbia as the department chair, as history department chair, to take a job as history department chair at ASU. So I was sort of in the transition back to my discipline, as it were, but not for long. And I was relearning the historical field, and got my AHR subscription back up, and even went to an AHR conference, an AHA conference, but it was definitely a new institutional setting, a new part of the country, and up close, kind of intensive in learning that comes with preparing tenure and promotion cases. Above all, I had to sort of learn fields to be able to translate my discipline to higher up disciplines and administrators, and again, from all sorts of fields which were not Russian East European history. So this theme of moving, migration, transition took on new meaning for me. And again, our president, Michael Crow, sees America, ASU, as the new American university, with this commitment to all these as inspirational things and aspirational things. And in tune with that, at ASU, my mission was soon transformed from re-engaging with history to engaging history with philosophy and religious studies, because Crow likes transdisciplinarity, and we're supposed to break down silos and boundaries to keep us from learning things together. So we were forced to marry in a kind of forced marriage with religious studies and philosophy. And that's not been a terribly successful experiment. So again, I was relearning fields of philosophy and religious studies from my undergraduate and graduate introductions to my long teaching in Columbia's contemporary civilization courses. So again, I had to go back to learn all those things. Thank goodness I had done my core teaching, so I could talk to my philosophy and religious studies colleagues a bit better. Along the way, and kind of as an outgrowth of 9/11, being in New York City on 9/11, I had a detour via veterans and veteran students, and how area studies kind of helped me go to a new field. My Soviet history course started attracting veterans students who asked me about the Soviet war in Afghanistan, where they had served themselves a few years later. And I had actually been visiting the Soviet Union during the war, the Soviet war, and in fact was in Turkmenistan in the fall of 1979 when Soviet tanks were already everywhere in sight. That's another interesting story. We spent all of 20 hours at Dushanbe, and again, Crow, I wrote to Crow after I was removed from my position as director of this School of History, Philosophy, and Religious Studies. I said, I've got all these students who are asking me very interesting questions, and I went back and sort of doing immense reading in the Soviet-Afghan War, and there's wonderful literature about that, and all sorts of lessons we could have learned and should have learned before we embarked on our adventure there too. So he said, well, create what you want to do. I created the Office for Veteran and Military Academic Engagement, and it started with a course on oral history called America's Recent Wars. And I had, again, oral history I learned from Ron Greeley here at Columbia, doing an oral history with Marshall Schulman, sort of on the job, a former director, and also from some other remarkable historians like the Italian Alessandro Portelli, who himself was very influenced by Russian formalists like Prop and Eichenbaum. So oral history has given me a kind of a reboot as a humanist, in that I've learned the importance of listening and understanding how to listen and teaching how to listen. And I think we spend a lot of time teaching our students how to read, write, and even speak. But listening, we kind of assume they learn from kindergarten, I don't know, and we don't think of it. And listening is also a skill that one could do more of. So I was in that course, and I wanted to try to open up students to different perspectives. It was half veteran students and half non-veterans, so it was in itself a kind of engagement. I asked them to read Zinky Boys by Svetlana Alexievich, who's going to come up again in a little bit. And the veteran students were the most moved by this. Those who had been in Afghanistan said that whatever they experienced was not what Svetlana Alexievich captured in that book. And then I had them also read another book in that vein, Studs Terkel's The Good War, and The Good War is in quotation marks, An Oral History of World War II. And again, Terkel introduces his incredibly rich tapestry of the diversity of American experiences of the war, embedded also in the experiences of Japanese, Russian, German, and other eyewitnesses to war, and with this note: quotation marks have been added not as a matter of caprice or editorial comment, but simply because the adjective good mated to the noun war is so incongruous. And that's another theme. So, war we may be facing, but it's not going to be good wars. And it rarely is. So this put me teaching a comparative history of modern occupations, colonial warfare, with veteran students in the class who kind of gave me a grounding and a street cred, which I didn't have. They could prove videos of what they were doing in Afghanistan and Iraq. And the other students were kind of spellbound, and then, but also got the veteran students to start talking about their experience. All of this kind of oral history and eyewitness led me to a new teaching experience, even in my Soviet history class, which was my favorite class here. I taught from the moment I arrived, and I still teach it at ASU, with alternating with Laurie Manchester, another Columbia PhD. So I have an avatar exercise in which I ask the students to imagine themselves in the middle of 1917, so after the fall of the Tsar and before the coming to power of Lenin, and describe themselves by ethnicity, gender, race, education, professional status, region, religion, and tell me which party would most address their needs based on their situation. And they are just amazingly creative in how they go back to history, and I then have them read real oral histories halfway through the course. I've been using Barbara Engels and Anastasia Posatskaya's collection of women oral histories. Very effective. I think I'm going to move more to Alexievich now. But again, the imperial turn, I think, has allowed us to, has freed us to explore identities of all kinds and imagine oneself back in someone else's shoes. And I think that's what area studies is at some level also about, empathy and learning to stand in someone else's shoes. And again, like at Columbia, the students I teach in that Soviet course, history course, come from all over come from many of them come from families who left the Soviet Union and who have a version of Soviet history from their own family oral history tradition, but they also now come from Middle East, South Asia, and even East and Southeast Asia. So again, the imperial turn has, I think, allowed us to help people understand the freedoms, the options, the possibilities, but also the limits and the bans, the place of violence in shaping people's experience and memories of those experiences in political social orders. And this is something that I think I was probably doing when I first started going to the Soviet Union. I would imagine myself, I said, how would I have turned out had I been born and raised here as opposed to where I was raised, this sort of accident of birth? Would I have been a heroic dissident? Might somehow doubt that. A loyal government servant? More likely. One part of a gray mass trying to avoid trouble and live some sort of ordinary life, however that was defined in Soviet conditions. The most recent place that area studies has taken me is in helping to design an online master's degree in global security. I'm learning this time from two ASU colleagues, one an international humanitarian lawyer and scholar, and the other an engineer who's an Army veteran, a U.S. Army veteran, and a scholar who's not to be held responsible for my misuse of his term civilizational conflict, but he's the one who I evoke in my title. Whatever's happening between the states of Ukraine and Russia is somewhat new and yet somehow familiar and very unfamiliar, and has engendered names such as hybrid war or frozen conflicts or civil, and then debates on whether civil war or foreign aggression. And what Brad Allenby, this is my engineer colleague, calls civilizational conflict is what people have been calling hybrid warfare even before Russia's war with Ukraine in 2014, what the Russian general Gerasimov called new generation warfare, Chinese thinkers call unrestricted warfare, and it's, I'll just read you a quick encapsulation of what they mean, namely that the focus of applied methods of conflict has altered in the direction of the broad use of political, economic, informational, humanitarian, and other non-military measures applied in coordination with the potential protest of the population. All this is supplemented by military means of a concealed character, including carrying out actions of information conflict and the actions of special operation forces. The open use of forces, often under the guise of peacekeeping and crisis regulation, is resorted to only at a certain stage, primarily for the achievement of final success in the conflict. This came out in 2013, and it could read like the Russian operation in Ukraine. So, and Gerasimov is the chief of the general staff of the Russian Federation in 2013. From Chinese scholars Liang and Sheng Shu, a similar thing. Faced with warfare in this broad sense that will unfold on a borderless battlefield, it is no longer possible to rely on military forces and weapons alone to achieve national security in the larger strategic sense. Obviously, warfare is in the process of transcending the domains of soldiers, military units, and military affairs, and is increasingly becoming a matter for politicians, scientists, and even bankers. This is warfare in the age of globalization. Allenby settles on civilizational conflict, as he puts it, not entirely in the sense of Huntington's Clash of Civilization, because that's something we're writing against, but in the sense of including all dimensions of civilization in a process of long-term, intentional, coordinated conflict, one aspect of which may or may not be conventional combat. So war is no longer just or even primarily the clash of two conventional armies with decisive battles leading to victory. Moreover, this civilizational conflict, most clearly identified with contemporary Russian and Chinese thinkers, but also with ISIS, has been driven by the scale and scope of America's own dominance in conventional power. And Ukraine has been probably one of the most commented on sites for this kind of new civilizational conflict and concept model. And again, one thing, just for the humanists in the group, Allenby has said this is predominantly a campaign of narrative, of identity, and not of conventional combat. And he recites the sort of meme of Novorossiya in the recent sort of war in Crimea as how important narrative, and who does narrative and identity if not humanists? So we face this kind of pressure of being weaponized in this civilizational conflict, and that's something I think I want to devote the rest of my time to. So, my most intimate encounter with the war of Russia and Ukraine came a year ago, almost exactly, in Kiev, thanks to Marko Suprun, another former Columbia student, who until recently was a Canadian-Ukrainian, and now is a Ukrainian citizen, and his American-Ukrainian wife, Ulana, a doctor from Detroit, who founded something called Patriot Defense, Zachist Patriota, to train Ukrainian doctors, in turn to train Ukrainian soldiers on the front in combat and trauma medicine techniques. The Ukrainian armed forces, which largely were recreated after the Russian invasion, also had no experience until then with trauma medicine for frontline soldiers. Patriot Defense staff had trained 22,000 soldiers since the outbreak of war last year. Marko helped me to start to get a sense of how the war is affecting all parts of Ukraine, from the large training base for all special operations forces in Khmelnytsk to the hospitals caring for wounded ATO fighters. And ATO is anti-terrorist operations. That's the word that's used to describe the army, because they're not officially at war on either side officially. And I met several of Marko and Ulana's colleagues, including a thoracic surgeon who recently had been awarded for his bravery and service on the front lines treating ATO soldiers. Which is, again, oxymoron, I shouldn't say that. Alexander Linchevsky came with his wife and 2 young sons, and we had a remarkable conversation about how he tries to explain to his 6-year-old Hrihori and his 3-year-old Taras why their father wears camouflage and is so often away from home. He decided to tell the truth from the start, but the greatest difficulty is how to talk about the enemy. They're terrorists, or are they Russian? And since both boys not only hear Russian around them in Kiev all the time, but also speak Russian in addition to Ukrainian, Alexander worries about prejudicing them against the people as they grow older. And he stated they don't have a television at home because they don't want to see the coverage of the war, and they don't want their children to see the coverage of the war. Another sad and characteristic sign of changing times was a workshop I was invited to also last September when I was in Kiev, hosted by a newly created Center for the Study of Russia, sort of the Harriman Institute of Kiev, believe it or not. The title of the conference was The Russian Military Threat, Myth or Reality. The workshop was introduced by Volodymyr Ohrysko, former foreign minister of Ukraine, who was the CEO of an independent policy research center called Center Дослідження Росії, Center for the Studies of Russia. Ambassador Ohrysko noted that even in Ukrainian official circles, the implication of Russia's threats to Ukraine's security took some time to crystallize, but now Russia is identified as a major, if not the major threat to Ukraine's security, and the new military doctrine signed this week by a year ago, President Petro Poroshenko. And Ohrysko reported that he had very much wanted to have Russian participants at this meeting, and had extended invitations to several of his colleagues in the defense and security think tanks and institutes of Russia, but all of them declined out of fears that they would be charged with state treason for any participation in such a forum organized in Ukraine. Such, Ohrysko lamented, is the sad state of affairs in Russia regarding anything Ukrainian. And this is one of the things I worry about for the future of our field, Russia's war in Ukraine and the division of the field with some very familiar players and some also very strange realignments and strange political intellectual bedfellows. And some of you may know that I've been having a sort of behind a sub rosa dialogue with Steve Cohen and Katrina vanden Heuvel, and also I've been involved with in the German Russlandversteher debate with colleagues there because Comrade Putin has become sort of a leader not only of the right international, with anti-US, anti-EU, anti-liberalism, anti-democracy, anti-transparency, etc., but also he attracts far-left critics of both US imperialism and EU capitalism. And after a long career of trying to convince Americans that Russian and Soviet citizens are more generally, were not only human beings, if you remember the title of a forgotten book in the 50s, Russians as Humans, I think it was called, but were diverse. Not only were they humans, but they were diverse, changed over time, and needed to be understood not as some sort of gray mass of Sovki, but as people. So Russophobia has come back as both a danger, I think, on the part of us, those of us who study it, but also it's being weaponized too by Russia to, out of some sort of attempt to create a nice victim complex, that we are all closet Russophobes, and we have this thing to criticize Russia. And not so long ago, and still, we also face something called Islamophobia in this country and elsewhere. And again, Islamophobia wants us to believe that Islam is all bad, and again, bad Islam is a product of politics. Political Islam is a product of empire, Orthodox and Muslim empire. Before that, it's a struggle of resource and not participation. Islam in of itself is not good or bad. It depends on the acts of the people who speak in its name and act in its name. Again, this is something I feel myself during the recent Olympics. It had become sort of a tradition, not a tradition, but kind of habit with me that after the breakup of the Soviet Union, I would watch the Olympics and kind of root for all the post-Soviet teams to see if they were still holding together as a sports powerhouse. And already Sochi was a test with that opening show, which I thought offered a very dark and brooding view of Russia's culture and history. And sure enough, Sochi was followed by Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk. So that maybe was a sign. But the Rio Olympics raised new challenges, of course, to my identifications with the anti-doping scandal and the banning of several Russian athletes from participation. But the same with Eurovision, that pop culture vision of Olympics for Europe, at least the other side. So all of this is, again, part of the civilizational conflict. It's being waged in pop culture, it's being waged in the media. And the other side of Russophobia is Americophobia, which is also not unheard of in parts Eastern Europe and elsewhere. And among those who identify or affiliate with Russia's presentation, and Americophobia can be reinforced with Ukrainophobia, EU-phobia, and other sorts of hatreds in not just the Russian media. And of course, it finds its response in American and European political campaigns, and I won't mention anything happening today in this country where it can be joined by Islamophobia. So in the last few years, I've had another remarkable experience of serving as dean and teaching at the Ukrainian Free University in Munich. And that has been sort of teaching. I've been teaching there 1914, 1922, the rise and fall of the first Ukrainian state, almost 100 years ago. And this is teaching the legacy of a post-Soviet, a post-revolutionary and post-World War II Ukrainian diaspora who've kept alive Ukrainian history, teaching it to a new post-Soviet Ukrainian diaspora in Munich. Again, these are students pursuing graduate degrees in 3 faculties. They're from all over Ukraine. They remain in constant and frequent contact with families and friends back home, but have decided to make a try in Germany for as long as the situation in Ukraine does not offer them the kinds of life and opportunities that they have judged to prevail in their homeland. This university was founded in 1921 in Vienna by refugees from Bolshevik Russia, from Bolshevik Ukraine by that time, and quickly moved to Prague, where the Masaryk government was a very warm host, not just the Ukrainian university, but to Russian universities. And then in 1944, they made a quick move to Bavaria on the oncoming wake of the Red Army arriving in Prague. Half of the faculty were arrested and deported with the archives and the library back to Kiev and Moscow. The other half, who managed to escape into the American occupation zone in Bavaria, refounded the university in Munich in 1954, or 50. So one of the questions that I got in the first time I taught this class was from Boris. He asked me, why are you so interested in this period of a foreign country's history, and what has changed in the last 100 years that might justify our returning to our native country? Which kind of puts the history of a country 100 years ago kind of in a very existential angle that I don't normally can face in Arizona, and not even at Columbia. So I said, at one level, it was easy to answer that Russia still is a threatening neighbor, but Poland and the intermarium nations are now Ukraine's most vocal advocates and partners, and that goes for solidarity, it goes for all sorts of other things. But at another level, there's much more difficult to answer, namely the kind of collective social trauma that our region is undergoing with its version of globalization at the end of the Soviet era. And again, so I come back to Svetlana Alexievich, and I've been under the strong impression of lately of reading secondhand The Last of the Soviets and Oral History. And again, it's a chronicle. Her story itself is a sign of hope, but it's also a chronicle of despair. And it's more than just a woman's voice, which it is, but a voice of vulnerable, courageous, tenacious people. It's a voice of despair and betrayal and all sorts of other things. And like in Zinky Boys, war is seen through women's eyes and voices as nurses, widows, mothers, development workers. And she refers a lot in this book to internally displaced Persons has a very gripping chapter on Sumgait and the sort of Armenian Azerbaijani pogroms. And most recently, as a consequence of Russia's undeclared war with Ukraine, 1 million people have sought refuge in Russia. Another 1 million are internally displaced in parts of unoccupied Ukraine. And now Ukrainian colleagues from Donetsk and Luhansk, as well as from Crimea, have struggled to find new homes and jobs in the West and Central Ukraine and beyond. So, although, again, this is not altogether new, because, again, my experience with Belarus warned me that this was in the cards when the European University in Minsk was forced to evacuate to Vilnius, where it remains. And again, at Columbia, I also had the wonderful privilege of sitting on the dissertation of Sergei Ushakin, who eventually published the book, The Patriotism of Despair, which testified also to this problem that Alexievich is now bringing back to our attention, and also testifies to the rebirth of anthropology in our field, which has been also one of the most creative fields in the revival of area studies, or the maintenance of area studies. And one of the things I, again, learned from my veteran students is about moral harm, which is a way of not calling it PTSD or TBI or other sort of thing, but and reflects not so much a medical thing as really what happens to people when they are forced to witness or take part in actions that violate their ethical moral code: murder, rape, torture, mutilation, all those sorts of things. Again, that's a lot of the story of Svetlana Alexievich. That's the story of our veterans who've come back from Iraq and Afghanistan. And and this, again, brings me to Eurasia. And I have a bunch of stuff there that I want to talk about. I'll put that in the longer printed version. My most recent trip to, as interim director of the Melikian Center, actually I had this trip arranged before, as was this one before I became director, was to Israel. And I'm very happy to see my host there, my wonderful host, Jonathan, part of our area studies world that many of you have known for a long time, and that I had the pleasure of first discovery through knowing the scholarship of many Israeli scholars, but also here at Columbia I trained 2 Israeli scholars, Amir Weiner, now at Stanford, and Igal Halfin in Tel Aviv. And what I came to appreciate, again, coming from my sort of Ukrainian, American, Russian perspective to Israel, was a militarized democracy that has been living with a neighbor, not unlike Russia, but different from Russia, since its birth. It has been, since its birth, suffered through several wars. The whole society is subject to the military service. And you know, of course, Israeli democracy is fragile and contested, and it has full of contradictions and complexities too. But I think Ukraine might look to Israel as their future because of the protected sense of this civilizational conflict that Russia is not going to go away very soon. So how do we deal with all of these sort of pressures and challenges in this new world? And I've been kind of going back to my old Eurasia talk and that article I wrote in AHR, and I was flattered and gratified when my successor and president of the Association for Slavic East European and Eurasian Studies, my dear friend and esteemed colleague Bruce Grant, notably an anthropologist, proclaimed in his presidential address in 2011 that we are all Eurasians. And he gave a kind of rhetorical footnote to my AHR essay. And what he said was that Eurasian points to a new generation of scholars who are offering examples of worlds far less closed, or at least contained, than we might otherwise have been casting them. Being Eurasian in this context is nothing more than a reminder of how difficult it is to do what the best of scholars from our community have long already known for decades, keeping our eyes and ears open to the multiple flows of sense, sensibility, context, and experiences that constitute the worlds we seek to better understand. And he said, remember September 11, 2011, another moment that registered a kind of unexpected and profound shift, when the next day in Paris, Le Monde ran the front page headline, "Nous sommes tous Américains," we are all Americans. A generous gesture, I'm contending, that reminds us in another way of how empathy can not only rewrite the centrality of other lives, but of our own. For a brief moment in a world of walls, many came down, and our perspectives on the globe, and perhaps even on each other, could look different and be reconsidered. But again, Eurasian, also inserts an existential moment into our collective project, a recognition of both the impossibility, or perhaps better put, the quixotic project of living in someone else's shoes, no matter what part of the world we are from, of occupying other times, other spaces, other knowledges, and other lives. And Bruce's own scholarship is a good expression of this, and again, I think it's perhaps not accidental that anthropologists have been among the most receptive to this concept of Eurasia, because their own discipline has been undergoing its own repeated and constant decolonizations and social soul searchings about their own epistemological and political assumptions, foundations, and origins. And Eurasia was also meant to capture some of what Edward Said called for in his own critique of Huntington's 1993 essay in Foreign Affairs and the book that followed. And again, his critique of the clash of civilizations calls for a profound existential commitment and labor on behalf of the other, capital O, a lifelong dedication to humanistic exchange, and not to see clash of civilizations as some new version of Cold War eternal conflict and militarization, but to insist that civilizations, like cultures or societies, were not just one thing, but they were mixtures, migrations, and boundary crossings, that there were no watertight civilizations completely separate from others. Instead of, and in opposition to Huntington's notions of exclusionary civilization, Said offered the actual diversity, complexity, hybridity, contestation. And he asked further, what is the West? What is Europe, after all? That's also up for grabs and redefinitions. So, although Said's focus was on the portrayal of Islam in Huntington, and Huntington admittedly had very little to say about one of the most important divides in that civilization, namely Sunni and Shia, but Orthodox civilization also tested Huntington. I don't think he fared well in that test. And I just want to point, I don't know how many of you follow Orthodox religious fairs, but this summer there was an aborted attempt at unity, the first attempt at harmony in 1,000 years, in Crete of the Orthodox community, with Moscow's patriarch competing with and challenging the patriarch of Constantinople. And again, in Huntington's eyes, Orthodox Russia wages war with Orthodox Georgia. Armenia, who he calls Orthodox, is allied with Russia as Christian, but Orthodox Russia is at war with Orthodox Ukraine, in part over Muslim Crimea, but now settled by other. So anyway, Orthodoxy, like Islam, is neither good nor bad in and of itself, and independent of the acts and behavior of those who speak in the name of various religions. Is equally true of Protestantism and Catholicism, even Judaism, all of which are divided over a set of values and practices these days called conservative, and those identified with liberal values, especially regarding gender roles and definitions of families, which are, after all, very basic components of our social identities. And what Huntington seeks to capture as Orthodox civilizations for centuries have lived with and among large and diverse Islamic civilizations, later Jewish civilizations, and Catholic Protestant, that is to say Western civilizations. And relations were not always clashes, and these cultural exchanges, borrowings, influences, sometimes forced, also contributed to what are usually considered the golden ages of these civilizations. So I'd say it's still about empires and their legacies, about borderlands and their conflicts, and diasporas and their contributions to culture and peace. Finally, in responding to Bruce's very generous and provocative, in the best sense, rereading of my idea of Eurasia, I think what unites us all is an ethnographic spirit, a comparative framework that almost kicks in automatically and keeps us more resistant to any kinds of exceptionalisms, whether they're Russian or American or Turkish or Ukrainian. Most of us have traveled often and for a long time to the region, and we have become accustomed to change, even if we've had more difficulty in understanding it lately, and maybe always. Many of us are disciplinary refugees like myself, and have even moved from one university to another in our careers, and we ought to take advantage of that experience and the mode of thinking and seeing and listening that it helps give rise to. And if we can share that with our students, I think that's the best we can hope for. And again, listen not just to our academic colleagues and interlocutors, but talk to those people that we as academic tourists have the most contact with, also fellow ethnographers. I have wonderful conversations with Turkish taxi drivers in Vienna and Munich, with Greek waiters and restaurant owners in Munich, and in Tempe, my barber, who gave me this Soviet Army haircut, in Tempe is a Bukharan Jew who is a Soviet Army veteran and who served in Kabul during the Soviet-Afghan War. So I get my haircut to stories of Talmud, to Kabul, to American students that he sees. Again, many Americans have especially since I moved to Arizona, I went to Las Vegas once, and I never want to return. I don't think, but I think Americans have this sort of Las Vegas complex that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, and we think what happens in Ukraine and Russia and Puerto Rico and Brazil and Austria doesn't matter to us in America. And I think that's just blind these days. And the students that we have at my new Melikian Center, who are those who go outside the academy, are mostly in the military security complex on the one hand, but also the civilian humanitarian side, including journalists. So I had students studying Armenian who had worked in Yerevan with refugees. I had students studying Macedonian who had worked in Lesbos with Syrian refugees. So that's our world, and I think that's the kind of people we're training. I think it's more relevant than ever that we reject the hermetic ceilings off of civilizations that assume only permanent clash. And our mission continues to be one of translation of cultures, primarily translating for our American students and colleagues the cultures of Eurasia, but we cannot avoid also occasionally, if not attempting to translate our cultures of the modern West to outsiders, however we define that inside and outside these days. And in so doing, to help shape global citizens and for a nation that continues to exercise extraordinary, if declining, power and influence in the world. And again, I was talking with Alex about a Bulgarian political scientist whose words I often find very revealing and illuminating and helpful, Ivan Krastev. I had the pleasure of meeting this summer in Vienna, and he suggests that we not help Putin or Erdogan or Orban contain their country and seal them off from the rest of us, and keep pushing for exchanges and dialogue. And if dialogue is not possible in certain countries, then move to third countries where we can keep this alive. And especially in the case of Ukraine and Russia, which is closest to my heart, places where Ukrainians and Russians can still talk to one another about the possibilities of some future, we hope, not too long in the future, reconciliation after some kind of cessation and hostility. And again, the mock conference in Lviv this summer was a good example of how Ukrainians, Russians, and Belarusians can still talk to one another, and let's hope that continues. And my reading, I've been, I'll conclude with going back to history and what I've been working on, which is the translation of Pavlo Hrystyuk's Zamitki и материалы до истории Украинской революции, one of the classics of the history of the Ukrainian picture of revolution in 1917 and to 1919. And I've been reading that together with Alexievich and another Ukrainian former sort of eyewitness to this account, Alexander Shulgin, who sort of became Ukraine's first foreign minister, wrote his account in French in Paris in 1935, also 20 years after the collapse of that revolution. And reading the Mensheviks and the SRs in sort of getting me back to writing the introduction for Hrystyuk's translation, which he wrote, by the way, in Viennese exile in 1921 and 22. Reading the memoirs of these eyewitnesses in 1917 and seeing their initial excitement and then their later disillusionment and defeat. And again, I had this sort of long relationship with SRs, social revolutionaries, from Pavlo Datsenko back at Stanford and now with Pavlo Hrystyuk. And they were sort of the human rights activists of their day, I would think. They were anti-war, they were for justice for all the underdogs. And what Hrystyuk wrote about reflecting back on the defeat of that first Ukrainian revolution, 1917, that the task of the liberation of humanity still is in front of us, and that as long as there are forces of oppression and national and religious and other things, that there is battle to be done. And he was writing this as a historian who was in exile, who, for whatever reason, decided to return to then Soviet Ukraine in 1922, worked in Soviet Ukraine under the watchful eye of the ČK GPU until 1930, when he was convicted of Ukrainian nationalism and all sorts of other things in a trial, and was sentenced to the Gulag, where he died. And his history was never published in Soviet Union, of course, and it's still hard to get even in Ukraine today, and of course inaccessible to people who don't read English, so don't read Ukrainian. So today, 25 years after the end of the Soviet Union, I think many of those who welcomed Gorbachev's reforms and the end of the Soviet Union now feel themselves also betrayed, as did the eyewitnesses in 1917, betrayed this time and robbed of their democracy by a new oligarchical Siloviki elites. And again, the democratic alternative is not just an intellectual choice. I think we're kind of in the middle of it in teaching in universities, which sort of have certain standards of academic freedom and intellectual debate and dissent. And so I think that's our mission for the future, more or less what we've been doing, but more of it. And again, I think even though this is a kind of very preliminary and very momentary view of the field, I think that's all the views we're going to get. We're not going to have any bigger views, I'm afraid. I'd be happy to read one if there is. And again, I want to thank Alex for inviting me to think about these things. I mean, I could say I'm kind of more engaged in the region than I might seem being out there in the desert. I've got one student who is a Turk, a graduate student in history, who's in Kazakhstan right now, writing his dissertation, working his dissertation. He was in Turkey during the coup, during the attempted coup. I have two other graduate students in Russian history, one in Syktyvkar in the Komi Republic, writing about Gulag returnees and non-returnees, and another student, John Romero, who's in Kazan, working on Tatar culture. And we had students this summer in Yerevan. I had a grad student in political science who's an Ossetian, who was studying Armenian, first with us, and then went to Yerevan during all the demonstrations there. Everywhere my students are, I kind of worry about them now and, and the world in which we live. And I think that's not going to go away too soon. So we should make the best of what we have and do what we've been doing, which is trying to help people understand one another and hope that we leave the world a better place than we left it. Thank you.
Mark, thanks so much. That was amazing. So we have some time now for Q&A and reflection. So just because we do have a lot of people here, let me just ask that you do two things. One is please identify yourself and who you are. And just a reminder, you are being filmed, and this is part of a record. And second, keep your comment or observation or question relatively brief so we can take a lot of them.
Valery Kuczynski, I teach at Columbia University at the Harriman Institute. Mark, you mentioned several options for Ukraine's future. One, that Ukraine may look at Israel for its future. Another, Ukrainian-Russian reconciliation. The third, oligarchs, Siloviki's future of Ukraine. The fourth option you didn't mention, but which is still possible, is that Russia
Empire.
really engulf.
Yeah. Yeah.
So personally, what do you think is the future of Ukraine?
I think Israel. I saw it can work there. I mean, it works, again, like everything else with a lot of problems, but it's they've been living with it for a long time, and Ukraine's only been living with this existential threat now for 2 years, but in some sense longer too. And I think that's kind of, if you accept this model of civilizational conflict as the kind of the at least medium term, if not long term future, which is sort of not declared war and not conventional war, but all this sort of multi-layered, multi-pronged other stuff, civilizational stuff, then I think, but with also always with the threat of armed conflict and violence there. So it's not gone, it's just kind of not traditional conventional warfare. So that if that is our future, and I think we as humanists, as liberals, as area studies people need to realize that, not only for our own research sake, but for our colleagues over there and for our students who have to, and who we're training to live in this world.
So it is possible with a little help of our friends, otherwise.
Yeah, well, that's my theme for Saturday. So the reason I'm really here originally, before Alex had the brilliant idea of making me think about what I'm doing, is for the 25th anniversary of Ukraine's independence, which I will be helping to commemorate and lament and celebrate on Saturday downtown at the Princeton Columbia NYU Club, and many other clubs too. And that is also, there the point I'm going to make is that Ukraine back then, I'm talking about 100 years ago, 1917, that's my thing. Back then, the international situation was even worse, perhaps because Europe was really divided. I mean, EU is not so unified as it has been, but it's not as divided as Europe was in World War I, with two big blocs slaughtering each other So that's, but Russia still is there. And the other thing is the justice, the corruption, which is kind of the socioeconomic issue, a set of issues that not just the Ukrainian Revolution, but the Russian revolutionaries also faced and saw being endangered by the continuation of war. War didn't allow them to help the revolution because too many resources were being diverted to killing people. And finally, leadership. And the comparison between the post-Soviet leadership and the post-1917 leadership, post-Tsarist leadership, doesn't, has both positive and negative dimensions. Most of the people who led the generation of 1917 were what we might call community organizers, again, human rights activists, socialists, mostly on the left, because that was what were people like that.
And patriots.
And patriots. And none of them profited from their time in government. None of them. In fact, most of them suffered for their time in government, either in exile or in the Gulag or being murdered before that. The new generation were all nomenclatura people, and again, they knew the system better than the 1917 generation, so they could actually run things better. But they were part of that system, and they were not oppositionists, and many of them have profited by their time in power, and that's and that's a problem. That's a problem, an opportunity. So it's complicated, these comparisons.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, sir. Yep.
Oh, I'm Rajan Parekh. I was in that Legacies class
Well,
back
another
in 1997.
veteran.
And I was just wondering your thoughts. Next year is also a pretty interesting anniversary, the 100th of the revolution. How do you envision commemorating that, memorializing that, and how do you imagine it's going to be commemorated in Russia, in Moscow, in Kiev, in Estonia, in Tbilisi, in Uzbekistan?
Well, the reason I went to Israel, as Jonathan will be able to tell you much more, is because that's what we were planning to do. Is how do we, between Israel, Poland, Europe, standing in for Europe and the United States, recast whatever we thought and wrote and taught about 1917 in this new environment. And so we are going to be doing a conference in the Harriman Institute, one in Warsaw, in the Institute of Jewish History, or the Jewish Museum, and then either in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, yet to be decided, or maybe both, to kind of talk about the global aspects of 1917, what it responded to and what its consequences have been, and sort of the themes that I just talked about, the disappointments and euphoria and all that kind of stuff. But it's a good question for Russia and Ukraine. And I'm kind of, and this, this sort of civilizational conflict, as my comrade Brad Allenby says, is about narratives and about identity. And one of the narratives is about 1917. For Putin, February 1917 is not going to be something, sort of the democratic bourgeois revolution in Soviet historiography is not going to be an attractive thing to remember. Even the Bolshevik October/November revolution has problems because he sort of repudiated at least some parts of Lenin when it comes to imperial things, and socialism is also not seems to be in his current idea package. So who's left? The whites, and I think they already are being celebrated. I mean, there are statues of Kolchak and Denikin, there are biographies, there's a cult of white generals, and Ivan Ilyin and Denikin are probably two of Putin's favorite historic philosopher eyewitness accounts. And this is something Tim Snyder gave a bizarre but fascinating lecture about Ivan Ilyin, this anti-European sort of Russian exceptionalist, West is decline, who died, I think in the 30s, who is now required reading at not the Central Committee, at the cabinet, at Putin's cabinet. And whenever they have whatever kind of philosophical discussions they have there, it's along these lines of sort of civilizational superiority. And again, it's a weird kind of, so anyway, I think the whites is what they have left. The counter-revolution is what we would call it. I think the Bolsheviks and the February people would call that counter-revolution. So it's about Russia, great Russia, one and indivisible. It's about law and order. It's about privileges of estates and elites, and about rolling back whatever 1917 was understood to be. democracy, socialism, etc. In Ukraine, also a difficult question. Ukraine still doesn't know it's 1917 to me. I mean, one of the things I do when I teach this course in Munich is I ask the ones who come back recently, and all of them have Ukrainian degrees from sort of either universities or pedagogical institutes or some kind of institution of higher learning. And they've all taken some kind of modern Ukrainian history course. And so I asked them, what did they know about Petlur and Khrushchevsky and all these guys? Not much, not really much. So it's not something that historians there have been able to kind of create a narrative for that is an alternative to the Soviet narrative, which is about the Soviet Ukrainian Republic. And that still exists, that narrative. And it's, you know, it's a narrative that had a lot of power behind it for a long time and is part of the Soviet legacy. So a kind of more democratic, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist narrative is what I'm trying to write myself. And it's strange that, you know, I do have some allies in Ukraine. So it's not just an American operation here or a Western, but I'm bringing back the tradition of them. I mean, this Christiuk translation, I think I'm bringing back their voices to tell their own story, which have been suppressed not only in the Soviet Union, but never known in the West to begin with. Thank goodness Shulgin wrote his in French, but even that didn't help get his case out to the world. So in Ukraine, it's also going to be hard to imagine what and 1917 is fascinating there. It starts the same in February, but it very quickly becomes a Ukrainian revolution, not just the revolution in Ukraine. And that's, you know, and that's true for not just Ukraine. It's Uzbekistan. It's everywhere else. And it's going to be hard, and yet it couldn't have happened without February in Russia. It couldn't, without Petrograd doing what Petrograd did, the Ukrainian revolution would not have been possible. And to some degree, they remained intertwined in tragic ways. I have to say that one of the last acts of Kerensky's government, again, something I never learned when I studied 1917 with Alexander Rabinovich in Indiana, was one of the last acts of the Kerensky government was to launch a criminal investigation against the Rada government for its insubordination to Russian laws. And they planned to arrest the entire Rada cabinet. But the Bolsheviks arrested them first, so that never happened. But that was Kerensky's last desperate act as he was about to lose power, was to launch an investigation against the Rada, which was, you know, made up of the same people, the same socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks and even a few Bolsheviks and cadets. That was the government in Petrograd. But anyway, no. So it's complicated.
Thank you, Mark. Elizabeth.
Yeah, Elizabeth Malkineer. Sorry. I used to teach both Soviet foreign policy and Russian history of Russian knowledge here. Well, anyway, hi, Mark. I wanted to find out how much difference there is between Western and Eastern Ukraine in outlook on basic questions or relationship to Europe, relation to Russia, and to go on.
Well, that too has changed dramatically in the last 2 years. First of all, because of this internal displacement, there are hundreds of thousands of people who lived in Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea who have moved to, as I say, unoccupied Ukraine, the central and western and northern provinces. So they're being forced together in new ways. The war has, I think, contributed to a kind of social mobilization that I don't think Eastern Europe has seen since Solidarność. I mean, it's not Solidarność, but it's as close as I think we've seen. And again, remember, this is the last. First there was 1991, then there was the Orange Revolution, and then there was Euromaidan. So this is the latest episode of this kind of social mobilization. But the war, especially, has forced people to make choices. Like these stories I tell you, from my last visit to Kiev, which they didn't have to make before, and people who normally speak Russian are now sort of symbolically, out of solidarity, more often speaking Ukrainian than, even though it's kind of a patriotic gesture, a sign of solidarity. Because I think the revolution of dignity, as it's called, was something that brought people together, but the war itself, I mean, the wars have this capacity of creating nations by creating enemies of nations, and the longer this war goes on, the more crystallized those sort of national identities are going to become. It took the 1917 generation about 3 weeks for them to get this first experience, because that's when the Bolsheviks launched their first war after the proclamation of independence in 1917 and 18. This time it took 23 years before Russia kind of assaulted Ukraine's solidarity. However complicated story you understand about that. And in 2 years, I think the national and social mobilization, again, how long it's going to last, it's hard to tell, because it's very exhausting being mobilized. As, again, I think Israel offers a good example. And as long as the government, if the government does not behave competently and in ways that are, I think, transparent to the people, it will not have its support either. Just like the Rada government lost support, the Directory government lost support. Again, a combination of external threat, but also somewhat incompetent management at the local store. So that makes it complicated to answer. I don't think the West and the East is nearly as diverse as different as they used to be, because they're now mixed more than they ever have been. Again, forced by the war and the refugee situation.
You, as I recall all the time, have a very sort of optimistic and sort of reassuring view of history, which I don't completely share.
Yeah.
I don't share it at all. And the one area you didn't tread on is one I wish you'd talk about, and that's been questioned. I don't know, that much about it, so I can't take a clear viewpoint. It's about the economic viability of Ukraine, which seems to be, each year seems to become less believable. Do you feel any basis of hope there?
Well, that is another. I mean, I gave a conference last year on ostensibly about Yalta, but I was assigned to talk about Austria because that's my mother's homeland, and I guess I'm assumed to know something about Austria. And one thing I thought was most interesting about Austria was precisely this problem of Austrian national identity coming out of World War I and the revolution of 1918 in Habsburg lands. The Austrian elites, are famous people like Otto Bauer and Karl Renner, continued to believe that Austria was not sufficient on its own, not economically, not politically, without the empire. So what was the alternative? Anschluss. From 1918, the first constitution of Austria had built in that it was part of a future Germany. Only thanks to the Allies at Versailles did that get written out of the Austrian constitution, and this Anschluss complex lasted until 1938, when it actually happened. And part of that was based on this idea that Austria was insufficient or inadequate as a state. And this is partly a reflection of the conditions of Austria's creation in the midst of the Depression and the inflation and all that sort of thing. But partially, I think it was a defeatist view from the beginning, and the Ukrainians, I think, had a similar Anschluss kind of view, that they could not survive without Russia until the war. And I think the war has kind of contributed to the serious undermining of that Anschluss, and also the notion that they didn't have the resources to fight back. I think the fact that they have lasted 2 years now against what could have been a worse war, I think has helped to sort of reverse that narrative of the state is, the national anthem is "Ще не вмерла Україна," Ukraine hasn't died yet. So, and it's not unlike the Polish one, "Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła." So, these are countries that kind of don't have a typically optimistic view of the future. They're kind of satisfied with surviving at this point, and I think that's the way we have to look at that. I mean, I think the economy is a mess, but the Russian economy, which ought to be doing much better, is also not doing so well. And if Ukraine thinks that Russia can bail them out, das gibt nicht, I think. It's not, yeah. And then Poland is the other alternative, and I don't think Poland is going to help Ukraine be bailed out either if it needs it. So the IMF and the EU and us, that's the, and again, waging a war while trying to combat corruption is, it's not an easy task. It's not, combating corruption is not easy anytime, as we know, even in our own country. But under wartime conditions, when all sorts of resources are being, very scarce resources are being devoted to combat and killing.
And while also trying to maintain global openness. Those two things also go together with our new banking and financial systems and correspondent accounts and all this that we know now was an integral part of Yanukovych's setup.
And again, I've been hanging out a lot with Karl Schlögl lately, who I kind of rediscovered too in the last few years. I've been going back to Munich and Ukraine. And Karl Schlögl has written a book called Die Entscheidung in Kiev, or Entscheidung in Kiev, which means decision in Kiev. And I don't think I want to go as far as he is saying that the whole fate of Western civilization is being decided in Kiev right now. I do think that it is certainly one of the battle sites between a Putin kind of state market capitalism, state capitalism, with not too much transparency and a lot of corruption and clientelism, or whatever it's called in political science, these are paternalism, versus a relatively more open market economy with some sort of separation between civil and military and between private and public and government and economy. So I think it is a battleground, not just metaphorical and but a real one, and that's part of our area, and we can't push that away. So there is still a kind of utopian part of the vision that there can be a better world, there can be more human rights, there can be more prosperity, there can be more peace, but it's not going to be easy. And I'm not so optimistic as maybe I was 25 years ago, for sure.
We have time for one more. Yes, sir.
Bob Harris, art school alum. I found your analysis of area study very interesting and instructive, which we don't we don't address that very much anymore. So it's really interesting. The Minsk II seems dead, but there are other strong possibilities to end the conflict in East Ukraine. Primarily, if Ukraine were to trade, some autonomy in East Ukraine. For Western and Russian economic aid. The obstacles to this is that the West is presently providing some military and economic
Sir,
aid.
but we're running out of time, so can I ask you to formulate a question?
And the oligarchs are sitting still on this.
Not so still.
The problem is that the country is really suffering. Is really is really being ripped apart, and the people too. So my question is, why isn't the West placing pressure, on Ukraine to accommodate, to?
I think they are. I think they are. In Germany and France, that's what they do every week. They ask, demand that Poroshenko.
2 days ago again.
Or maybe to take that question and push it a little bit more, what are the limits of Western influence on Ukraine, and what are the cross pressures to that?
Well, again, in the sense of Ukraine as a sort of site of this civilizational conflict, Ukraine was very much split, and I think even for a long time against NATO membership, and now most opinion polls have most Ukrainians in favor of NATO membership. So that's changed, one thing, since the wars. Again, I find it hard sometimes to remember which century I'm in, because 100 years ago, during World War I, Ukraine kind of wasn't on the agenda until 1917. For the most part, Britain and France, which were the main allies of Russia at the time, bought Russia's line that Ukraine didn't exist, and if they even talked about it. But in 1917, a couple of French journalists were followed by a British and French diplomat from Petrograd to investigate what was going on. They saw that there was a national revolution going on there that was not the same as what they were seeing in there. And so they started trying to get Western support for Ukraine. And eventually France became the first republic, democratic, and they were very proud of this, to recognize the Ukrainian People's Republic. Britain became the second, and we were about to do it, but then the Bolsheviks took over and things got messed up in the central, and the Brest-Litovsk peace happened. So Europe was ready to help then, but didn't really but even then, that was just a piece. That was the people in Kiev. The people in Petrograd still wanted to see Russia together. They preferred to see something that, you know, they understood Tsarism, and they thought, well, Russia, we understand that, we want that to be together, which sort of was what Bush was doing with Gorbachev in 1991 when the Soviet Union came apart. We wanted to the last minute, the U.S., to keep the Soviet Union together. We thought Ukrainian nationalism was another one of those, you know, goulash, or no, not chicken Kiev things, and dismissed it as a troublemaking sort of thing. So again, we in the West send mixed signals. We don't really understand the situation. There are different levels of the West operating vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia. In the end, so Ukraine was recognized by France, Britain in 1917, then by Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire in 1918 in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So Europe was helping, and without that support, Ukraine could not have survived another, at least 1918. So what I say is Ukrainian national movement was necessary, but also outside support. And also outside enemies kind of settled the deal, namely Bolshevik Russia ended that. And because Bolshevik Russia was excluded from the peace talks in Versailles, there was very little that France or Britain could do to stop what Russia was doing in Ukraine. So this kind of I see repeating itself. Now France and Britain, France and Germany are tasked by the Minsk group to sort of pressure the Ukrainians into making concessions so that the Russians will stop fighting. And again, at the same time, Russia's machine is operating to destabilize the EU, to destabilize governments. And I arrived in Vienna 2 weeks after the first far-right candidate almost won the presidency. He may still win the presidency. He's an ally of a man named Konstantin Malafiev, who invited this Austrian presidential candidate to Crimea. So again, this war is being fought in Vienna, it's being fought in Paris, it's being fought in New York, and it doesn't have to be. And again, war is not everything that's happening between our countries, and that's the other thing I want to remember. But it's an unfortunate part of it right now. So I think Minsk II is dead because Russia doesn't want it to go any further, above all. Russia is very happy with a destabilized, unstable Ukraine and its border, and with Europe divided over what to do about it. So whether that's Putin's plan or not, but that's certainly the benefit that he gets from it. So I think Minsk II probably was dead from the beginning. But
and on that, Mark, you've just given us just really a tour de force here. So many interesting issues to think about, and
I was cutting
your
like
perspective.
mad.
I know, and you were cutting like mad, but I'm going to try and get the paper from you and see if we can post it or make it available. But all I can say is I think I speak for everyone here. We miss you, and we miss your energy and your insights and your inspiration. Thank you. But that means you have to visit more frequently.
But you made me partly what I am. So I thank you too.
So thanks very much again. Good luck in your visit here, and thank you, everyone.
All right.